I'm Todd Johnson, and this is Earlylands in Conversation. Our topic today looks at the interplay of intelligence, covert action, and secret statecraft in the conduct of international affairs. We are joined in this discussion by Professor Rory Cormac, who is unquestionably one of the leading global scholars on the theory and practice of covert action, both in history and in the contemporary world. Rory has written a number of books on the subject, including most recently How to Stage a Coup and The Secret Royals, Spying and the Crown, From Victoria to Diana. Rory has researched and fronted 3 documentaries for UK Channel 4, and he regularly features in a wide variety of UK and international newspapers and TV and radio news broadcasts. We're very pleased to welcome Rory Cormac to Earlylands in Conversation. Rory, thank you very much for joining us today. Where are we catching you at? The UK, I presume.
I am. I'm at my university office in the University of Nottingham.
Fantastic. Are you settling into the summer sort of slowdown, I hope?
Yes. No.
Yes.
It depends if my boss is listening or not.
Yes, exactly. Now you turn to the research side of things, right?
Yeah, that's the one. Teaching's finished now, and hopefully we have a nice long summer of archival research ahead of me.
We can jump right into it. I think we have you and I have talked about this. We could probably do 2 or 3 hours of this conversation about the role of intelligence and covert action, which is definitely in the headlines today. I've long been a fan of your work. You know, you've got, 5 books out at this point, and you seem to be highly productive. Every one of them is eminently readable, which, you seem to have a perfect mixture of academic history and with a narrative verve that is deeply attractive, to people who are looking for popular history as well. Tell us about your academic focus, because I think it's particularly unique, and how studies of intelligence and covert action fit into the academic disciplines of history and international affairs. I mean, is it a growing subfield? Tell us how to think about it.
It is, and thanks for the kind words. That's the approach that I've always tried to take. But to be honest, it's not that difficult, because what we're talking about is so interesting, and it hits that, for academic terms anyway, that sweet spot between something that is really, really interesting, and I want to read about it, people want to read about it, but is also very significant. And there aren't that many things, I don't think, that are both really, really interesting on the one hand and really significant on the other hand. And what got me into my niche area, which essentially is the study of the theory and practice of covert action, past and present, is this. I've been doing it for 15 years or so, but in the last, 8-9 years, it's been this weird puzzle where covert action has dominated headlines. It's been everywhere, from the illegal annexation of Crimea through to Russia-Trump 2016, all the way through to what we're seeing today. There's been so much coverage, with commentators seeing it as successful. People, generally, until the last few years, people thought that Putin was quite good at this sort of thing. And yet it's supposed to be secret. And I found that paradox just really interesting. What is this thing that I'm reading about in the New York Times every morning? Breathlessly,
not so covert action.
Which is not so covert, exactly. And so that was it was a driver of my my recent book, How to Stage a Coup, was trying to square that circle. What is this thing that everyone's talking about? How does it work? Let's get behind some of those headlines. How does it work? What's the role of secrecy in international relations? And that's what I'm particularly interested in, is the role of secrecy in statecraft. And to answer your follow-up question about the growing area, it is growing. And what we're seeing is there's always been a rich tradition, particularly in American academia, of the history of intelligence more broadly and of covert action. That proliferated, particularly post 9/11, as intelligence was, for other reasons, in the headlines with the WMDs. But what we're seeing in terms of our study of it now are 2 things. One is the move away from the US-centric and Anglospheric approach to thinking about intelligence, which I think is really important, because one of the things that I look at in my work is to note that so many countries engage in this kind of thing. When we talk about covert action specifically, the history books are all about America. The headlines today are all about Russia. But, and this isn't to create any kind of false equivalence, but lots and lots of other states also engage in secret statecraft. So one, we're seeing a move towards a more comparative approach and looking at how different states do this stuff. And the second trend, which I think is equally important, is trying to integrate this type of thing into our wider understandings of history and international affairs, not seeing it as this cottage industry on the side where you have specialists in intelligence who kind of know all the acronyms and know the committees and stuff, but then don't know how it fits into the broader international relations theory. And I think it's really important to try and bridge that gap for intelligence scholars to talk to international security scholars and make sure that we are integrated in their debates.
So when I think of the past, this almost quarter of a century, you can think of asymmetric wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, but the rise of civil wars like we saw in Libya, Syria, Sudan currently. And now, of course, we have war between near peer states, Russia and Ukraine, tense standoffs between China and Taiwan, India and Pakistan. It's a pretty broad sweep of history, but tell us how to think about it from the perspective of an intelligence historian. Kind of what is the epoch that we're living through now from your lens?
I think it shows that, a breadth of history and the breadth of different types of conflict and challenges that we've faced over the last quarter century shows the centrality of intelligence across all of these different things. And so in terms of the lens that I would use, it would be, how is intelligence integrated into the overt policies? What role is it having? Is it a kind of a force multiplier? What's the relationship between the overt and the covert? And I think the challenge is we just focus on the covert because it's interesting, and we kind of forget sometimes that this is always there, and the challenge is to understand the interplay between the overt and the covert, and also the interplay between the internal and the external. I mean, we can focus a lot on what Russia is doing to Western states, and obviously more acutely to Ukraine. But when it comes to Western states, there's the interplay between the external and the internal, because Russia is exploiting schisms and cracks and vulnerabilities in our society. And if we treat the covert action as a completely isolated thing, I don't think it will help us defending against it, because there are internal schisms which Russia is exploiting. So I think that two lenses there. One is the overt and covert, and two is the merging of internal and external. But I would go further back. With the historian in me, would go right back and say, all statecraft, so much statecraft has this element of what we now call covert action in it. And one of the things that really made me smile as I was reading was Elizabeth I, so the English monarch in the 16th century, and she was doing what we now call covert action against King Philip of Spain in the Low Countries, and she was essentially covertly funding mercenaries in a rebellion against Catholic rule. And she wanted to do it covertly. And I remember seeing her advisor writing to her about using, and I quote, covert means to subvert King Philip. So I think there's another lesson there, which is this isn't new. The states have been doing this for a very, very, very long time. So we as scholars and commentators need to recognize that and integrate it into our wider study of war and peace.
I guess probably just because it's on the front page of The Guardian or New York Times or 24-hour news coverage with some former special forces operator talking about the latest mission, that doesn't mean that it's happening more often. It's just that now we have media outlets that clearly see that it brings eyeballs and it sells papers, right?
Yeah, and so that's the intellectual challenge. Does the increase in reporting mean an increase in action? Does it mean that it's less successful or more successful? Does exposure equate to failure of these things? And the answer is not necessarily. It's interesting intellectually, but also it's important in how we as a community understand this, because I think how we understand and report covert action, particularly Russian disinformation attempts, actually has an impact on the effect of those Russian disinformation attempts. So it's more than an intellectual academic challenge. if we over-report Russian disinformation attempts because they're interesting and they sell papers, there is a risk that we breathe oxygen into those disinformation attempts and end up doing Russia's job for them.
I certainly don't want to be guilty of that, but I think we do need to talk a little bit more about Ukraine and Russia. We're watching a nearly constant stream of news from that conflict, with Operation Spiderweb only the most recent, but certainly gripping, example of that. And that seems to imply a conflict with a truly vast, overt and covert campaign that extends far from just the physical battlefields of Ukraine. How are you looking at the war from the context of where it fits into the history of intelligence and covert action?
That's exactly right. That's exactly how I and other historians are looking at that. Because I think, first of all, we need to recognize that we don't know what's going on, particularly in the covert side of things, and we as so-called experts in the field, we don't know. We're not privy to any material. We don't. Most of us don't want to be privy to any material. We just watch and various operations with great interest, like everybody else. And I'm always quite cautious of academics who kind of go on and think they've got some great insight into exactly what Ukrainian intelligence is doing now and why and how. What I think that the prism, or the thing that we can bring to the table, and the way I try to understand it, is by putting what we think we know in the broader historical context and the broader theoretical context. So, for example, sabotage. There's been a lot of reports of sabotage over the last, since the invasion started, really, but particularly the last 18 months. In Europe, we've seen it's regularly in the newspapers. A lot of low-level stuff, but also some more acute and alarming things. And I know that things like protecting national infrastructure against Russia attacks, not just in Ukraine but across Western Europe, is a big topic. So how do I think about that? We as academics can ask, well, what is sabotage in the first place? How are we kind of understanding this type of activity? What are the parameters? Because it can be incredibly broad, and if we don't have that understanding, I don't think we can counter it legislatively as well as kinetically. But what's the difference between, to use counterterrorism language, an almost self-radicalized person who has been outsourced by Russia to go and just set fire to a bin outside an IKEA or something, versus take a much more professional attempt to take out a power grid? There's a big spectrum there. So I think helping to try to unpack some of that. Who does it? Is this Russian intelligence? Is it outsourced? There was a good article recently talking about sabotage in the gig economy and the kind of the covert outsourcing nature of the dark web and how they recruit. When do states do it? What are the effects of sabotage? I think are really important. Because we can bring in a historical perspective here and look at different sabotage campaigns or attacks in different contexts, from World War II through to Cold War. How do we know it's sabotage? How is it reported? So I think what we as academics can bring to the table isn't great insight into what's going on, because we don't know. What we can do is use an applied history approach to distill some of those core dilemmas, some of those core choices, which can then, I think, help the public understand what's going on, and also help inform policymakers and other practitioners just have a bit of analytical clarity, particularly in a world where things get mythologized very quickly, and there's inevitably a lot of rumor and misunderstanding and excitement. And I think there's a role there for academia and that longer historical view to contribute to some of those debates.
What academics are supposed to do, not be driven by the news cycle, right? You put your finger on what I found one of the more interesting, fascinating, disconcerting trends. Russians using this apparent outreach to sort of the broken toys of society, right? These young men in Eastern Europe who are recruited online to, like you say, go light a bin on fire or go take some photographs of NATO helicopters. They'll get 200 euros for it. Or I saw one in Latvia, a promise of a used BMW 3 Series, very tawdry. Do you see this as a symptom either of the Russian services being truly on their back foot, having to kind of use this as a scraping of the barrel, or conversely, is it actually a really novel and highly effective way to sort of have 4 or 5 layers of remove between the actual instigator of the operation and the individual who's doing it.
It's probably a consequence of mass expulsion of Russian
Right.
so-called diplomats that we've seen over the last few years from Europe, which must have, nobbled their
I mean, it was hundreds of officers, right?
hundreds, yeah, literally hundreds of officers have been expelled from parts of Europe over the last few years. So that must have nobbled their networks, their tradecraft. So one would assume that moving towards what's been called the gig economy would be a consequence of that. So in some ways, it's not ideal from their perspective, and they're working quickly on the back foot because the West has upped its game and been a bit more forthright in expelling them. However, the world is full of unintended consequences, and I think having to rely on those disaffected youths and dark web and just recruiting people with a few euros to go and set fire to a bin, that is more difficult to can be more difficult to detect. It can be more difficult to counter, and that's problematic. The trade-off, I suppose, thinking about it, is it's pushing Russia towards more of that low-level nuisance. It's setting fire to an IKEA warehouse is bad. Like, that's not
Right.
sugarcoated. That is bad, but it's not as bad as cutting undersea internet cables.
Right. It's essentially low risk for the services, but low impact as well, right?
Yeah, yeah, and I think so. That's probably more what we're seeing as a consequence of that shift in almost the political economy of covert statecraft. The question is, what impact does that have? And I think I'm always quite wary of ascribing too much talent to Russian intelligence, because sometimes there's a way of thinking, particularly on disinformation. I think we're starting to see it a little bit more with the sabotage things now, and now that's in the news, is that we just start seeing Russian designs behind everything that happens, and we assume that it's all joined up. We did the same thing in the Cold War. We assume that it's all joined up and there's some sort of grand plan, and Putin's this grand chess master, I'm mixing my metaphors, pulling all the strings.
Right.
And I think a lot of it is opportunistic and, just taking advantage of vulnerabilities while they can.
It was one of maybe the director of MI6 or MI5 who had referred to the Russians as essentially going feral. Okay, we have a young no-hoper who's willing to burn down an IKEA. Well, we'll throw 500 euros his way and see what happens.
Yeah,
right?
I think that's a fair description. I like that description of going feral. It's quite strong from MI6, but I think it's true. What we need to make sure, and this is a classic question across all types of covert statecraft, is we don't conflate number of attacks or incidents with impact of those attacks or incidents. And I think we've seen a bit of that in disinformation, where people have conflated the number of Russian clickbait, comments below the line, fake account, whatever it is, and there are loads of them, and then assuming that because there are loads of them, that it's really consequential. And my concern with the sabotage, and I don't want to underplay it, it's really hard to have these conversations because you've got to get the balance just right.
Right.
I don't want to underplay it, but at the same time, we don't want to conflate or assume because there are lots and lots and lots of low risk incidents that is incredibly consequential. So I like to work backwards. Think, okay, well, what's the strategic goal here? And is Russia through this any closer to that strategic aim, rather than just thousands of fires in bins? I'm being slightly flippant.
Let's shift gears a little bit. Speaking of British intelligence, you have a clear specialty in the operations of British intelligence through history. Take us beyond silly stereotypes from the Bond series or the latest Netflix show. What defines, in your mind, the current British intelligence community? Is it something akin to small but highly effective, searching for a purpose, or something in between?
I think it's a very important part of British defence policy. I think that the UK has always valued intelligence quite highly. And special forces have had to find a role. They've been searching for a role historically. I think they've got it now, particularly post 9/11. But my approach to it has always been, I think it still holds up now, is the UK is still a declining power, and who knows how far the decline still yet to go. I dread to think, but we are still a declining power, and yet we still have, and it's no great state secret to say that we haven't got much money at the moment, like many Western nations. So we're a declining power. Our capabilities are on the decline, and yet the UK has, because of historically mostly, global responsibilities, or at least perceptions of global responsibilities. And there's a mismatch there. There's a disconnect between the UK wanting to be a global power without the money, means, and capabilities to actually do that. And I think historically, that's why the UK has valued intelligence, because it's seen as a means of plugging that gap. It's seen as a force multiplier where the UK can still exert influence and meet its avowed policy goals in a way which is, to be slightly blunt, on the cheap. And I think that still holds up today. So even where, I mean, Britain's been going through austerity and all sorts for the last 15, 20 years, even when the military has been cut in real terms a lot and has caused all sorts of consternation amongst military watchers. Foreign Office has been cut. BBC Overseas Service, World Service has been cut, which I think is a disgrace, but it has. Who hasn't been cut? Who is the one part of state that's been going up a bit? And it's the secret part of state. And I think that's not an accident. I think it's seen as a force multiplier to plug that gap between responsibilities and capability. So I think that's the British approach. What we see is we see an integration into foreign policy, I think, is one kind of hallmark of it. Foreign Office is quite closely involved. It's not, MI6 is not a rogue elephant going off doing crazy stuff like James Bond would have us believe. And secondly, I think a lot of it is about low-level disruption in the covert action side of things. It's about making life difficult for adversaries. One former MI6 chief put it quite nicely. He said, "We like to try and keep the adversary on their side of the pitch, not our side of the pitch." So it's just about trying to disrupt. But then, I mean, the easy answer, the boring answer, is to say Bond is nothing like British intelligence. But the more interesting answer, I think, to your question is the interplay between the two. And one of the things I love reading in the archive is where Bond's name pops up, because he's still a cultural reference point. And even the British Foreign Secretary in the archive would say, "We need I don't want to be all James Bond here. I'm not going to sanction this particular operation in the Gulf, I think it was. Let's not go James Bond on this." So I really like the actual genuine interplay between the cultural representation of Bond and then
it's a policy metric,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Well, I'm very proud of ourselves that we've gone 5 or 6 questions here, and we have not talked at all about the U.S., and I think we need to. A major trend that we're seeing in conversations about intelligence in the US, particularly under the Trump administration, is the apparent or perceived need to revitalize human source collection, or HUMINT. Give us your initial thoughts on how you see the effective use of HUMINT in current intelligence operations. It could be the US or just more broadly, globally. Is simply putting more proverbial spies on the street a real answer in a highly networked AI-centric world?
It's clearly difficult, and I think the highly networked AI-centric world makes traditional human tradecraft more difficult probably than ever before, with the amount of biometrics and things and one has to overcome in order to operate covertly. But I believe that there is always a role for human sources, and I think it would be wrong and ahistorical to think that we solely live in this brave new world now with AI and everything, and therefore we don't need human sources and start to run them down. I think every time there's a prediction that the age of human is over, I think is wrong and is always premature. And if the American intelligence community starts to run down human tradecraft and techniques and not collective knowledge, then I think they'll massively regret it in a few years' time. And as we all know, it takes a long time to build these things back up. You can't just turn off and turn on. It takes a long time to do this, and also the collective knowledge, the institutional memory. Any claim that the age is over is premature, and I think there's always space for human sources. And I think even in the age of AI, I think they'll actually become more difficult, but more important, because in an age of fakery and tech and uncertainty around all sorts of stuff, I think you're going to need a human source on the ground, probably more than ever before.
Maybe the basic research will be done by AI, but to find that competitive advantage or to find what's not in a public repository somewhere, aka what's in the mind of a policymaker, that can only be brought to you by human intelligence. I think there is some validity to it, but it has certainly become part of the narrative of the Trump administration's rebuilding, so to speak, of the U.S. intelligence community. But I think it's a good soundbite more than anything, probably.
Yeah, I think so. And you don't want to dismiss all the AI stuff, because it clearly is incredibly important and changing how we, or all industries operate. But I think your point is spot on, that the intelligence world isn't necessarily unique in this sense. We will all be using AI tools to enhance our processing power, or the amount of things that we can do. One assumes, but there's always going to be the need for human brains and emotions. And I think whether that is in my world, and I can start hoovering up archives, but I would say this, I still want the human to be able to interpret that. And I think it's exactly the same, and more acute in intelligence, because it's more consequential than my world. But it's the same principle. The AI will help if used appropriately, but you'll always need the human.
Exactly. Well, so we've talked about AI, we've talked about Russia, Ukraine, et cetera. What are some other themes that you and your colleagues are thinking about in your space that maybe we haven't talked about now, that are interesting from the standpoint of intelligence historians, that are taking over the narrative with you and your peers?
One of them, and it reverts back to what we talked about at the start of the conversation, is about the movement away from the Anglosphere in covert action, and also Russia, and thinking, what other states engage in this kind of stuff? What are we missing if we take the specific narrow definition, American definition, which is essentially a legal definition of covert action as enshrined in US code, and we start to try and interpret international affairs through this prism? Are we misunderstanding how Russia, how China approach secret statecraft? There's no direct translation of covert action into Chinese. So if we're looking at from an American perspective, are we then misunderstanding Chinese statecraft? And there are consequences there. And who else is doing it, and how does that affect our ability to understand it, to wield such things ourselves, and to counter such things? And I'll give you an example. I've just been looking at propaganda in the Cold War, and looking at Soviet propaganda targeting parts of sub-Saharan Africa, British propaganda targeting parts of sub-Saharan Africa, and American propaganda. And then I had a research assistant. I was very lucky to have a research assistant who was going through Kenyan National Archives. And what the Kenyans on the ground were worried about, it wasn't us, it wasn't the Americans, it wasn't the Soviets. They were worried about Ghana and Somalia. And they were doing covert action, doing subversion, coup plotting, and all that kind of thing. And we, as historians, write books about the CIA and say, well, the CIA was doing this, and this, pulling the strings in Africa. But so was Ghana, and so was Tanzania, and so was Egypt, and so was Somalia. And it was an absolute mess. And I think trying to untangle that, or recognize that smaller states, local states, regional powers have their own agency, have their own intelligence agencies, and do their own stuff. And it's not just seeing whether it was Kenya in the Cold War, or pick random country in Southeast Asia or Africa now.
Right.
They're not passive battlegrounds for Russian and American influence operations, or now Chinese influence operations. There's an ecosphere here, and we need to understand how the local actors interplay with internal conspiracies, local factional politics, to help us understand how propaganda, disinformation, subversion, covert influence work. So I think one of the trends is about trying to almost push back on that orthodox narrative that scholars, often American, this isn't a criticism at all, often American, writing about the CIA using CIA sources. And that's the bulk of the literature. And there's an inevitable consequence of that. I mean, these books are great. They're very great. The scholars are fantastic. But there's an inevitable consequence. You end up writing from the American perspective and not recognizing other countries doing this stuff and the interplay between the target and the American and the CIA. Right? And it just helps to nuance, I think, about the role of covert action and what it can achieve.
That is a great point, not to just look at things through the lens of works that are coming out of historians in the US and the UK. Well, tell us what is next for you? You've done a book every few years, which is very impressive, and they're all, very well researched and very readable. But what's next for you on your agenda?
Well, I've just finished my next one.
Another one,
which will be out. We're out next year. Provisionally titled Fakers. And
Fakers, I like it.
I thoroughly enjoyed writing it. Over the last, I think about 2019, 2020, the UK government, it's another British one, the UK government declassified 8,000 files from its top secret propaganda department in the Cold War, something called the Information Research Department. And within that were the most staggeringly detailed operational files that I never, ever thought would see the light of day. So what I've done is I've traced a small team of mavericks and misfits operating out of the Foreign Office, whose job was essentially to do British forgeries and fake groups to counter Russia, to Soviets, to counter the Chinese, to counter lots of nationalist leaders in the age of decolonization. And it's their journey through the 1960s and charting the impact of these forgeries and how they interacted with other actors, which on one level sounds, I love writing it because the characters were just crazy.
I'm sure you have some, great character sketches and such in there.
It's just absolutely magnificent fun, and with lots of really new stuff around whole kind of forgery departments, which never before been written about. It's very exciting, but it's on one level it sounds historical. On another level, everything they were talking about and everything they were doing is going on now. And
just different technology, maybe. That was it.
That's all it is. The same language, the same dilemmas. So they were, in the 1960s, they used the phrase countering disinformation. They talked about, we were talking just earlier about the dangers of overplaying Russian disinformation in reporting. They were having the exact same conversations in the 1960s. And I was at a NATO thing last year, and maybe I was just being irritating and being the irritating historian in the room. But I read out a document from 1960, and it was almost word for word. It was a countering disinformation summit, and the document I read out was a Foreign Office file from 1964, I think, and it was almost encapsulated word for word what the panel before me had just been debating. And I was trying
cut and paste, change the date and move on, right?
I was trying not to be smug, but it just made I think a really clear point that so many of these debates, these dilemmas, these policy choices are not new. And AI and technology in the cyber world is clearly ramping up the scope of this stuff, the scale of it, the speed of it. But those fundamental choices, how we measure success, how we counter it, they are, I would say, timeless.
Absolutely. So Fakers, and it'll be, what's the release date?
Oxford University Press, 2026.
2026, Fakers. What we always like to end on is asking our guests to recommend 1 to 2 books to help us better understand their focus area, whatever it may be. But for you, I think obviously that would be intelligence and covert action. Fiction, nonfiction, what should be on our nightstand? What do you think is really that will open our eyes about what it is you study?
A really good recent book that came out just a couple months back is by a colleague of mine called Daniela Richterova down at King's College London, who's got a book out called Watching the Jackals. I would recommend that. It's all about Czechoslovakian intelligence's relations with various Middle Eastern terrorists and revolutionaries in the later Cold War, and I think it's great because it's a new take on Cold War intelligence, looking at Czechoslovakia rather than the KGB or CIA or MI6. It's quite nuanced. It's using sources that that I don't have access to. That I can't. Most of us can't read. Which to give a really novel account, but she also tells it in a great way. It's a great accessible. It should be made into a movie. You've got all these spies and terrorists meeting, watching each other on the streets of Prague. I think that's a great book.
And like you say, I mean, the Czech service, which you don't hear much about, the Czechoslovak service, was one of the best in the world. So watching The Jackals, and I'll put that into the show notes as well. So Rory, this is, again, you and I could go on here for another hour. I'm sure every conversation you have about this stuff, you have to cut it off because everybody has so many questions. But I really appreciate you taking the time, and I hope maybe we can have you back on then when Fakers comes out next year.
I'd love to. Absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Todd. I've enjoyed it.